to a new episode of Books and Beyond from the Winter Park Library, recorded live in the recording studio at the library in beautiful Winter Park, Florida. In Books and Beyond, we have conversations with writers, musicians, artists, presenters, and other contributors. Most of our guests have appeared live at the Winter Park Library or will be presenting soon. We hope you'll subscribe to the Books and Beyond podcast and that you'll stay up to date with library goings-on at winterparklibrary.org/events. That's winterparklibrary.org/events. I'm Michael Werner, and I'll be your host for our interviews. Enjoy the show. Hello out there, library patrons, readers, and smart people everywhere. Thanks for joining us for another episode of the Books and Beyond podcast. I'm Michael Werner, as you may know. Before we get started with our guest today, I wanted to make a couple of housekeeping announcements. Number one is I've talked before on some of our podcasts about all the events that go on here at the library. And I just keep talking about it, but I never actually did a whole lot of research on it. So I picked up a recent calendar of events here at the library. And this was, I think, from a month or so ago. In that month, there were actually 73 events going on at the library. I thought there were, 20 or 30. There is stuff going on all the time. The categories of events are creative arts, film and music, health and living, history and culture, careers and school, stories, language and literature, technology and gaming. I mean, it's like a mini university here. So if you're interested in learning about anything, I would definitely check us out at the winterparklibrary.org/events. That's winterparklibrary.org/events. And also, I want to remind everybody, we're open to hearing your comments, your complaints, your wishes on anything that we're doing here on the podcast. So if you have comments for us, please send us an email at podcast@winterparklibrary.org. Or if you do end up leaving us a review or a rating on whatever source you're listening to this at, whether it's Apple Podcast or Spotify or whatever you're using, leave us a rating there. And you can also make comments there. So we do want to hear from you. Today's guest is a really special person. I think a lot of you in Central Florida will know the name from his work as a journalist for the Orlando Sentinel. It's Greg Dawson, and I'll be formally introducing him here in a moment. But I was thinking about how to introduce Greg because I knew a little bit about him, and I picked up one of his books, and the biography on the back of one of his books, I think it says it perfectly. So I'm just going to read the biography here about Greg. Greg Dawson stumbled into journalism in high school when the sports editor at the newspaper in Bloomington, Indiana, offered him a part-time job on the strength of a letter to the editor on which Dawson unaccountably forged the name of a classmate. He was hired anyway, and like Satchel Paige, never looked back. Over the next 49 years, Dawson worked as a reporter, TV critic, Metro columnist, and consumer columnist at newspapers in Bloomington, Indiana, Boca Raton, Florida, Grand Forks, North Dakota, Wichita, Kansas, Boston, and Orlando, and as a humor columnist at the Orlando Magazine. He has written two books on his mother's experience as a Ukrainian Holocaust survivor. And you can find Greg at gregdawsonbooks.com. He's written a couple other books, which we'll be talking about. So welcome, Greg Dawson.
Thank you so much, Michael. It's great. It's great to be here.
Yeah, it's wonderful having you here. And I was hoping today we could spend a little time talking about your career in writing and sort of how you got started, just sort of the life of Greg Dawson as a journalist and as a writer. And as you may know, a lot of the people that are listening to this podcast, they want to be writers. Everybody that loves the library loves writing or wants to be a writer. Everybody's got a book stuck in their top drawer somewhere. So tell us a little bit about your own history, how you got started.
Well, since you put it that way, Michael, I can tell you that yes, that's true. You have so many people out there, untold number of people want to be writers, and that never included me.
Okay.
I grew up. I grew up as that was not one of my ambitions. My chief ambition was to play center field for the New York Yankees.
We have that in common as well.
Yes, and that. Other than that, I had no particular ambition. I never ever had thought I wanted to be a writer or would be a writer. I was indifferent, which is a kind adjective for my scholarship, my career in high school and college. And
were you kind
I
of
sort of drifting.
Kind of a goof off, Greg?
Kind of a little bit of a goof off, maybe more of a back of the class clown.
Okay.
I spent an awful lot of time in the last row making stupid sophomoric remarks and jokes. And I just had a hard time buckling down. I didn't see the point in many of the classes we took. I never saw the point in things like algebra or identifying 50 parts of a dissected crab, for example. So I was pushing back against requirements like in junior high. Didn't bode well for my career as a student at IU, Indiana University, where I think to date I have maybe 45 credit hours. So if I get any credit for this
we'll
session, maybe could you maybe?
We'll see if we can pass that along.
Work my way towards a career, graduating someday. But anyway, to go back, I never had any ambition to be a writer. I was interested in words. My dad was a great punster and a great reader as a young boy, a young man. He was very frustrated that I didn't love literature as much as he did, but I liked words, and I did a lot. Most of my reading was newspapers and Sports Illustrated, and mostly sports. And I did a lot of reading of that kind and the back of cereal boxes and so on. But I never, and I had great interest in words, but I never thought I might be a writer. In my peer group through high school, I knew who the smart people were. I was usually the dumbest kid in the so-called smart class, and I would read some of what they had written. I thought, boy, that's so polished. I can never write that well. So I had zero ambition to be a writer, and thank you for reading that introduction. It sort of explains what happened. It was really my career in writing was an accident in the way it's described on the back of the book.
Well, what happened?
Well, as you read, on one Sunday afternoon in my junior year in high school, when I should have been doing my homework, but it was not, I got very bored, and so I sat down and I typed out very carefully, meticulously, a 2 or 3 page letter to the sports editor about Big Ten basketball. Lots of statistics, lots of names, lots of opinion. And I sent it in because I hoped he would use it in his letters section. And again, it says on the back of the book, for some reason I have still to this day I have no idea. I signed the name of one of my classmates, a guy named Gary Vance. Don't ask me why, because I wanted to get it in the newspaper, but for some reason I didn't want it in there under my name. I cannot tell you why. And I thought, well, there's probably not a chance it's going to get in the newspaper anyway. But about a week later, I opened up the newspaper, and there it was, under the headline, "Give Gary a Listen." Yeah, and it had this long letter and signed Gary Vance. And the next thing, of course, next thing I knew, Gary Vance was getting a call from the sports editor inviting him to come over to talk about a part-time job. And Gary thought, I have no idea what you're talking about. He said, well, you wrote us this really good letter. I can see you're interested in sports. You can type. I need some help on the weekend, taking in some game stories from coaches around the area. And Gary said, I didn't write that letter. And Bob said, well, who wrote that letter? And Gary thought for a minute. He said, I guess the only person I can think of who had done something crazy like that would be a guy named Greg Dawson. And so the sports editor called me and asked me to come down to the office. And I did. And he described the job that he wanted to get, a part-time job. And I thought, that sounds like fun. It sure beats going to school or doing my studies. So I started my junior year in high school working at the newspaper, not student newspaper, the real local newspaper, because I'd never taken a journalism class, never taken a writing class, never did. And I started, and it was fun, and I loved the atmosphere. And
it was a paying job.
It was a paying job, yes, absolutely. And by that spring, I think it was that same year, before I knew it, I was covering my own school's baseball team for the local paper. It was very, very strange to be interviewing my own classmates after a game for a report in the newspaper, in the Coach, you know. And so that's how it got started. And that was pretty much it for me. From then on, I discovered something that I could do, and I enjoyed the atmosphere. And so from then on, it became really difficult to apply myself to my studies because I was already where I wanted to be professionally. I thought, this is what I'm going to be doing. I did understand the value of higher education. And so I did. I really tried at IU, but the only courses that interested me were English and history and so on. I couldn't apply myself to languages and what we called, the sciences and things that you need, the requirements to get a bachelor's. So basically, after a couple of years, I decided I have to get out of Bloomington if I'm ever going to complete my degree. So by hook or crook, with the help of some family, somebody we knew, because I certainly didn't have the grades for it, I got into Oberlin College, which is a really, really fine private school near Cleveland. I didn't deserve to be in, but they got me in. And I lasted one semester there, one benighted semester. All I did there at Oberlin was get up in the morning and read the Cleveland Press, the Cleveland Plain Dealer, and in the afternoon, I think it was the Cleveland Press. So I was kind of hopeless. And so I could see that after one semester went badly, I decided I'm going to stop wasting my father's money. And I decided to throw in the towel academically and just go to work full time. So that was 1972. So that was the last time I darkened the door of a university class. And so that's how it began. And
what happened with Gary? Is Gary forgiving?
Gary went on to win the city golf championship a couple of times, and I've forgotten what his reaction to it was exactly.
Yeah, that's funny.
But to this day, I still can't figure out why I would have done that.
Yeah.
It's part of the prankster. I think it's the prankster gene in me or something. I thought it would be funny to somehow it would be a practical joke to put his name on the letter. The point being, at that point, I had no ambition for my name to be in print, and I got over that finally.
Yeah,
when I started getting bylines in the newspaper, it was pretty neat to see that. And it's the only, and my mother would cut out the articles and everything. So that's kind of how it got started. And from then on, and especially back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, little did we know we were living in really the golden age of newspapering. I mean, we didn't think of it then, but it really was. It was a great time for newspapers. Part of that had to do with Watergate. And so it was also possible then in that era. It was really easy if you wanted to move around. You could get a job if you're tired of working at one newspaper. You had and you had established a record. You could find a job somewhere else, which explains why my itinerant history there, going from Bloomington to Boston to Orlando. From Bloomington to Boston to Orlando, to North Dakota for one winter only, Kansas, back to Bloomington, and then back to Orlando. Well, you could do that back in those days because there were jobs. And you can't do that anymore because there aren't any jobs anymore, and there are hardly any newspapers. So I look back on it. It was really fortunate to work at a time when you now regard, as I said, kind of a golden era for newspapering. And then in between, I got involved in writing the books, which is a separate story.
Right. And I mean, I guess traditionally, the at least at those days, Greg, correct me if I'm wrong, probably the way into journalism was through a journalism degree at a university, and then you'd hire on as a intern or a part-time. You kind of did what you did, but more formally.
Yes, I mean, that's true. And almost all the people I worked with, not all, but almost all the people I worked with did indeed go to journalism school. But here's the thing. I don't think that journalism school was essential at all. It's not just because of my experience, but what I saw, I had a lot of colleagues who went to journalism school, but many of them, maybe even a majority, didn't, especially if they're around my age. They went to college and they studied liberal arts of some sort, either history or English or economics or sociology or something. And I feel that made them better journalists. There are a lot of great people in journalism schools, teachers, professors, and so on. Many of them actually came from the industry, came from the journalism. But it's something that I think you really learn as a trade. I think it's really a borderline academic subject. And I think that think of the great generation of journalists represented by the one before mine, the Lipmans and the Restons and all the great names of the Russell Bakers. all of those great names of journalism back in the 30s and 40s, they didn't go to journalism school.
Right.
There weren't any.
Right.
And I think that probably we'd be better off if there never were journalism schools. I hate to say that because, as I said, there are a lot of interesting people in those schools. By the way, not to get into it, but those themselves are now in deep trouble because the student newspapers, the one at IU, for example, the Daily Student, basically going out of business. And so they no longer really have a department of journalism. It's more media. Everything's now defined as media studies. Not to get too far off that track, but so that in that sense, yeah, it was a lot of people like me, but most of them back then did get in via that way. Not through forged letters to the local newspaper.
Yeah.
I always say, kids don't try this at home.
Yeah, right. So when you moved from one paper to another, was that usually for just better opportunities as you saw them, or how did that?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, I was in Bloomington, and it was got to be, let's see, it was 1973.
And you had gone back to Bloomington?
No, actually, I'd been there since high school until 73. I was going to IU,
okay.
Trying to go to IU. And in 1973, somebody who had worked as an editor at the Herald Telephone, at the HT in Bloomington, went to the Knight Ridder paper in Boca Raton. And my mentors, he was one of my mentors' best friends, the sports editor of the paper you and I both know.
Yes.
Great writer named Bob Hamill. He was kind of my mentor. He's the one who hired me. And when his best friend went to the newspaper, he was a great editor, went to the little newspaper in Boca Raton and offered me a job down there, I thought, I don't think I want to go, because I'm happy here. But Bob said, "You've got to go." And I said, "I just don't think so." He said, "Look, it was we were talking on a terrible, miserable March day in Bloomington. And so we were talking about it that morning. At lunchtime, we went out the front doors of the newspaper, and it was a horrible, miserable day." He said, we went out and stood out there. We're going to walk down the street to a little diner where I had lunch. He said, "Look at this." He said, "Look at the snow collecting on the side of the streets." It was just a miserable say, "Are you crazy? You got to go." So I did go and went to Boca Raton, and I spent a few years there. From Boca, I went to Grand Forks. I followed the same editor, Grand Forks. What was I thinking?
Yeah.
And there it was just too darn cold. I just couldn't take it. So there, after spent one winter there, went to the Wichita Eagle and Beacon, or the Beagle as we called it. I spent only a few months there. It was the month I left. I remember this distinctly because it was the month that Elvis died in 1977. Went back to Bloomington where I was offered a columnist job, and I did that. I did that for a few years before I got restless again, and I put out an application to be so there was a opening for a TV critic at the Boston Herald, which at the time was owned by Murdoch, and so on the strength of some clips that I sent them, they
and
hired,
had you been doing TV review work prior to
only
that?
Not formal TV review work, but I would do columns that were related to TV. As a matter of fact, one of those is one of the things that led to the writing of one of my books. But they hired me, and I went to Boston. I was a TV critic. By the way, anybody can be a TV critic. There's no training for that, just like there is no training for anything in journalism, basically. And so I did that. We loved Boston, but we couldn't afford to live there, so ended up in Orlando. And then one thing led to another. An editor, after a number of years, I could not work for the editor there any longer, so I went to Indianapolis. Was a consumer columnist for a while. Never done that either. Again, anybody can do that if you haven't a chutzpah. And then ultimately, the editor in Indianapolis, who had hired me to go up there, he went back to Orlando, and so I followed him back to Orlando. And that was my last stop, where I was also a consumer columnist. You may or may not have remembered that. It was called The Last Resort.
Yeah.
I know anybody's read the paper for any number of years. Remember a consumer column called The Last Resort, where I was, trying to get people's money back for them, or a new dish, or a new washing machine, or one of those things.
Yeah.
And so I did a little bit of everything. Sort of a really poor man's newspaper renaissance man. I mean, very poor, and and so it's crazy. I mean, you couldn't really sit down and design a career like that. And today, you're correct. It wouldn't work today. There's too few jobs available, and the newspapers that are hiring rely overly, I think, overly so on the formal qualifications, the journalism degree and so on. But again, I was lucky to have worked when I did, and now I'm just writing for Winter Park Magazine. But,
yeah, we'll get to that in a second. So. During all that time, most of your work was as a columnist, right? Not as a, let's say, a hard news reporter.
No, I was an okay hard news reporter, but I was at heart a columnist. Yes.
Okay, and then here in Orlando, I know you had the TV column, then you had the consumer column,
and the Metro column in between.
Oh, the Metro column. Okay.
In between, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And how did you find, for particularly in the consumer area, you had people writing in and you just picked the best stories and wrote about
I
the
had
research?
more stuff than I could handle. I mean, ultimately, I really got burned out after 6 or 7 years because I'd have so many people writing to me, calling me with needing help. With a wide variety of consumer columns, complaints. One sort of a major one down here, frankly, was contractors. Oy vey. I mean, horrible experiences with contractors and subcontractors, and I'll spend a lot of time on that. Roof repair, tree work after the hurricanes. A lot of people getting ripped off by tree companies, but it was also nickel dime stuff. I can tell you I love this story because it happened when I was doing the consumer column in Indianapolis. But my favorite all-time consumer help story involved helping a single dad get his son's pet hamster. The dad his son had spent time with him in Indianapolis. He lived in Dallas, and his son came to visit, and he brought his pet hamster with him. And so after the visit, and we returned to Dallas, he said his son was just distraught because he had forgotten Peanut, his hamster, and what could I do about it? And I said probably nothing, but I got in touch with the airline. I explained the situation, and I guess it was his ex-wife who had the hamster still in Indianapolis or something. I said, well, I'll call him. I said, I doubt it. But I called the airline. I got the right person at the airline and dressed up the story. And they agreed to fly the hamster back to Dallas from Indianapolis with a private escort.
Wow.
That one of the airline employees took the hamster, Peanut.
So it had been left on the plane?
It actually left back in Indianapolis.
Oh, okay.
And, yeah. Oh, actually... Actually, what happened was the kid got to the airport with the hamster and was told, no, you can't take the hamster. You can't take the hamster. And so they had to leave it there. And so, yes, they got one of their own employees to take the hamster in a special container and fly it to Dallas to this kid who was overjoyed. That's my proudest moment. And it didn't involve much money or a product, but I was so proud. And years later, I got a thank you letter from the dad saying, you don't remember me, but... And so it was a lot of fun doing that.
You must have had a lot of unhappy people too. I mean, in doing that, especially
unhappy,
some of the shysters.
Furious.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. And,
how did you deal with that? I mean,
Well, what I would do, the people complaining, the consumers, I would say, let me see what I can do.
Right.
And I found I'd never done a consumer column before, and I was kind of shocked by how much influence the newspaper had. It wasn't me. I mean, I would contact a company, and you had to get the right person. You would go to the media relations person or the PR person, and what you would do is it's the old cliche about you catch more flies with honey than vinegar. Mm-hmm. You wouldn't storm in there and say this is an outrageous situation. What are you going to do about it? You go in, you describe the situation, and you say, well, I'm sure this rarely happens. With a company like yours, but if there's any way you could sort of make this one right, you said, I'd love to be able to report in my column that there was a happy outcome. And when you approach them the right way, especially if it was a newspaper of any size, Indianapolis, Indy Star, and Orlando were both large enough for companies to care. I mean, the PR person's only interest in life was making their company look good.
Sure.
They didn't care how much the company would have to spend or anything. They weren't even evaluating the complaint. They thought, what can we do? Okay,
here's our
situation.
Chance, this guy's to look good in the paper.
This guy's going to write about it. We might as well end up looking good. What you do is you flatter their corporate vanity. Tell them they're a wonderful company. People won't be surprised they made good on this, et cetera, et cetera. And I was shocked how readily they would actually agree to do this. And what it was to me was a tremendous example of a lesson in the power of the press, as it was then. It's changed now.
Absolutely, yeah.
But at the time, it really did matter when a company was called by a newspaper, and they knew they were going to be in there, and it mattered how they were going to be portrayed. And to me, it was a real lesson, because it was in real life, in real time. Yeah, here's this problem. Will you do this? Yes, we'll do that. If I myself had walked in for myself, just appealing for myself, and they probably wouldn't give me the time of day.
Right.
So anyway, that is another thing. You look back on it, you think, boy, it's unfortunate that newspapers don't do that anymore. And at some point, when the Sentinel changed publishers, that's how that column ended. They decided they didn't want to do that anymore. Yeah. And I thought that was really, really dumb decision, because it was one of the sorts of things you could do to connect with readers, just like with obituaries. Another death knell for newspapers is when they started to charge for obituaries. The ones we see in the paper today,
I didn't know that.
They're incredibly expensive. Just take the Sentinel, for example, on a Sunday. If you see some very nice write-ups for people on where the obituaries used to be, those things are incredibly expensive. When my mother passed away just in 2023, I wanted to place obits in Atlanta, where she had lived for so long, and in Orlando, because a lot of people in Orlando knew her name because of the books I'd written,
right,
and in Bloomington. So I called Atlanta, and I found out that getting a rather short obit, modest obit with a picture in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution just for the weekend was going to be like $1,500.
You're kidding.
$1,500.
I had no idea.
$1,500. And so I thought, well, sorry, Mom, but and so the Sentinel was about the same. And so honestly, the only thing I could afford was to get one back in the Bloomington newspaper, and even that just for the weekend, even that was like $400 or $500.
Wow.
Now this is so dumb on the part of newspapers, because if you ask traditional newspapers, what interests you? What do you always read? Well, horoscope, jigsaw puzzle, the
crosswords.
Crosswords, yeah. Crossword puzzle, obituaries, and when they did that, it was incredibly dumb, self-defeating move. It was one of the many wrong moves newspapers made when online became popular and newspapers started to panic because people were reading news online instead of the newspaper.
Right.
They panicked and they started giving it away free. And they did that at the Sentinel. And I remember we had a staff meeting back in the 90s, and they said, folks, we're going to be changing. All the stories you're doing, we're going to put them online so people can read them. And that way we're going to juice circulation. And a number of us reporters would put our hands up and say, basically we're just dumb reporters, but how's that going to work? I mean, if you're giving it to them free online, why is that going to spur circulation? They said, to subscribe to the actual newspaper. And they said, no, you guys don't understand. We know what we're doing. Guarantee it's going to boost circulation. Well, famous last words, right?
Right. And
now, of course, you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. Actually, they tried by establishing paywalls, right? And paywalls didn't work out so well either. So it was one of the many things newspapers did badly that just hastened their demise, really.
Do you follow the industry still? I mean, the newspaper industry.
I don't follow it as an industry. I'm aware of the newspapers that go out of business.
Most of them.
Yeah, and I read the Sentinel because but it's the digital edition.
Yeah.
We're retired on fixed income, and it's darned expensive to get the paper edition 7 days a week. And I much prefer it because I'm a tactile person, like people my age. You like to hold the newspaper and fold the newspaper and all that stuff. but I now just read digital version. And I have to say, the Sentinel, like many newspapers, does a phenomenal job with the staff that they have, much reduced staff they do. Really, they do things that people who read it but not in the industry, don't think about it carefully, don't understand that when if the Sentinel ever stops doing that, nobody else is going to do it, because blogging is not journalism.
Right.
They're not going to do the essential things that the Sentinel does. And so I don't know. I guess it's almost inevitable, I guess, that that day is going to come. But it would be a shame in this community and others for that to happen, because journalism is not blogging, and blogging is not journalism, I should say. And it's a shame that people think that too many people think, well, you don't really need the Sentinel, just go online. If the Sentinel and other newspapers disappear and you go online, you're not going to find any real journalism. You're going to find what you find now is this sea of opinion and blogging and stuff, undifferentiated mass,
Greg, this is amazing, and we could probably talk about this for hours.
Are people bored about talking about newspapers?
Well, no, about journalism, about writing and
Yeah.
everything. I think, and you have sort of a secondary career or a side career coming along here too, where you got into book writing. And I did want to ask you, by the way, as I was looking at some of the books that you've written, one of the books in particular called "Hiding the Spotlight," it's your mom's story. Was just a phenomenal, heart-wrenching story, and I wanted to see if you'd want to come back at another time and talk just about that book, if you'd be okay doing that.
I'd love to.
Yeah, great. But in general, could you just talk about how you sort of moved into book writing from journalism, or how did that happen?
Well, that too was not.
Well, you're one lucky writer.
I am. Yes, I am. Not by any plan, and actually. I can tell you that it also, accident is probably not exactly the right word. It was a matter of circumstance. I never saw myself as a book writer. I think that writers are like athletes in a way. I think running is my favorite analogy. I think that they're runners. Marathoners and sprinters are two very different things. The greatest marathoner in the world will not be a great sprinter, and vice versa. And I always saw myself, and I know this is true, by temperament, by experience. I had no training, but my natural inclination is, and this goes back to being the class clown, guy in the back of the class, is to be a sprinter, to write short,
Right.
To have tiny,
That's why the columns work
short,
for you.
yeah, short thoughts, little thoughts, and that was my thing, and that's where I was comfortable. I never liked long narrative writing. I was not comfortable doing that. It was too hard to organize a long piece of narrative writing, and we've all read the really great narrative writers in journalism, and people like John McPhee and people like that. And I thought, well, I could never do that. So nor could I imagine ever writing a book which would involve somehow connecting, having a story and connect over the space of 300 pages. I would have no idea how to do that. So I never even thought about writing a book. But what happened ultimately was that, and this is how I also discovered my mother's story. I don't know whether I want to get into that
Not too much right now, but
conversation.
yeah.
But it actually it was only as a result of a television show that I actually ended up writing a book. Maybe that's a good starting point. It was not just any television show. It was 1978. That was also a real important date for me in my personal life, because I discovered something about my mother I'd never known. I was like 30 years old, and it was only because of this television show that happened, and that led.
What was the show?
Well, it was in 1978. It was the miniseries called The Holocaust.
Okay.
On NBC. It was the first. It was the first serious treatment of the Holocaust by American television, and it was I think an 8-hour miniseries over 4 nights, and it was a huge event in this country, not just a television event, but a sociological kind of event, because it dealt with this most important event of the 20th century, and And so I was writing a column in Bloomington at the time, and I thought, like most columnists, I thought there's got to be a column in here for me somewhere. I didn't know where, but I thought there must be.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how. And then it goes on from there to. If you want me to just give a little bit more for the how that led to the writing of the book.
Yeah,
okay.
please.
Okay.
Without giving too much away of the story itself.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Okay. Well, my thought was there must be an idea for me here somewhere. And I thought, well, maybe my mother has a few memories of her experience from World War II that she could share with me, and I could somehow cobble it into a column. Because all I knew then was that growing up, she was Russian. Of course, she played the piano, and it made me a lot different than the other kids in the neighborhood in Bloomington.
Sure.
I knew she had come to the U.S. after the war with her sister. That's all I knew. Okay, and so I thought, well, maybe she has a few memories of her experience, and so I called her at the time my dad had died. She was working in university in Wisconsin. I called her and I told her about this miniseries, and I said, I thought maybe if you could, there's time you could tell me if you have any particular memories of the war that maybe I could use to do a column about this miniseries coming up, because it's a really big deal. And it was then, only for the first time, that I learned her real story, her entire story, which I had not grown up. I didn't know it as a kid. She hadn't shared it, which is she not just did she have an experience during the war, but she had one of the most remarkable experiences as a Holocaust survivor. I didn't even know what that meant, actually. I didn't know. I knew what the Holocaust was, but I had no idea that she was caught up in the Holocaust. All I knew was that she was Russian and had come over after the war. And so what I thought was going to be a 10 or 15-minute conversation ended up being, 45 minutes or an hour with her for the first time ever, giving me the broad outlines of her experience during the Holocaust, which is what led to a very long story in the paper, and subsequently 2 years later to the writing of Hiding in the Spotlight.
Yeah, which we want to have you back to talk about.
So again, TV comes into play. But
wow.
So
so let me ask you this, and we're kind of going to finish up here shortly. Do you have any? I hesitate to ask you this question because you sort of just you fell into writing accidentally. What advice would you have for people? Younger people, probably for the most part, that want to write in news or in the equivalent of online newspapers, I guess. I mean, they want to be. What should they do?
Wow, that's such a difficult question, because
it's not easy anymore, is it? It's not like go to journalism school and apply to the local newspaper.
It isn't, and it's not just that. You're exactly right, but it's not just that. It's because the whole landscape of what we call journalism has changed so profoundly, and from the disappearance of actual newspapers as we knew them, the advent of blogging, which many people mistake for journalism, and so it's really difficult to give it, for me, for my experience, to give advice over this long, to another generation on how they should go about it, because I can't give them directions. I can't give them advice to do something that may not lead to help them to find a place for their writing to be read. I mean, I think that writers want to be read, and that's so difficult to find these days. And again, I guess anybody can go online and blog, but I have a feeling that the ones who want to be writers, they want more than that, I think. And but I would say, stepping back from that in a general sense, what I would tell anybody who has an inclination to write is it sounds like somewhat a cliche notion, but just to write. Well, first to read as widely as you can,
right.
And don't try to copy anybody, but and read a variety of things. I don't mean just journalism, but anything that interests you, really, anything that sparks your imagination, your intellect. All that is good, and not to get and not to be a slave to some mistaken notion of what a, quote, air quotes, writer is. Big mistake. There is no such thing. If there were, I never would have ended up being able to make a living at it,
Right.
because I didn't fit any of those requirements, and so I guess I would say basically, if I could do it, almost anybody could. Now, in terms of how you go about it, there is no plan. There are people who will tell you there's a way. Yeah, you got to go to journalism school. You have to do this, but they're wrong, and I think increasingly wrong, because of that world that's just kind of disappeared. And but just to trust your instincts, you have to prepare. You really have to love language, and you have to learn love words, and realize that at least for me, that's going to be your thing. You may not know much about anything else, but you have to be like the best you can possibly be, or better than most people around you, at words, at sentences, understanding how to be effective, a great or effective writer. There's so much horrible writing out there. And when I say horrible, I mean people who don't even know it's horrible, because a lot of it comes from people like corporations. They're scientists. They're academics academics write some of the worst books in the world, because they're professors who write books who they're under the mistaken notion that they're lecturing a captive audience. They are, when they teach in college. They're the captive audience. Those students have to sit there and listen to this stuff if they want to pass the class. People open a book. If they don't like it, guess what? They're out of there.
Right.
And so you have to be conscious of, I hate to use the word to entertain, but you have to engage people. I think you have to engage their intellects, their sense of humor, their souls, their something. You have to reach them in some way. And there are many places in a person and people you can reach to touch in some way, to motivate them to read. And it has and so you have to constantly be aware of that. Again, there are people who write for themselves. They keep diaries.
Sure,
they write.
Sure.
They write poetry.
Sure.
That's not me.
Yeah.
I don't write for myself. If that's, I would never write just for myself. And people say, well, that's not a very good thing. If people want to write, isn't that a good thing? Of course it's a good thing. It's just not for me, and I don't think it's for most writers. My mother said, as a pianist, she said, every musician needs an audience. Well, I agree. And every writer needs an audience. Now, there's some people say, oh, no, I just enjoy sitting down at the piano and playing for myself.
Yeah.
God bless them, right? Just like people who keep diaries and write poetry for themselves. But I don't think that's most people, and that's certainly not me. And so anyway, I guess the thing is, be conscious of writing in a way that you're going to engage another person.
Okay.
And sometimes you have to stop and think about that, because when you don't, it leads to really terrible writing, where it's essentially stream of consciousness stuff. A lot of this, I won't say all blogging, but one thing you'll notice when you go online, what does most blogging have in common? It's endless. I mean, most blogs go on and on and on and on. There's undifferentiated mass of words and thoughts, and people, there's no space limitations, so people just go on and on and on. And as Truman Capote said about Jack Kerouac, he was not a fan of Kerouac, and on the road, Capote said that's not writing, that's typing. and to me, I know people may disagree. I tried to read Kerouac. I found it unreadable. To me, it was just typing. And to me, there's a big difference between typing and writing. And so if you can just start, anybody wants to be a writer, do understand the difference between typing and writing.
That's good advice in and of itself right there.
Yeah, it was great advice.
Well, let me ask you the last question here before we sign off for this episode. And as we said, everybody, Greg's going to join us in a future date for another episode on talking about hiding in the spotlight, which is his mom's story. You got any new projects you want to tell us about? You working on anything new? I know you said you're working. You have a column at Orlando Magazine.
Yes, I write for Winter Park Magazine.
Oh, Winter Park Magazine.
It had been Orlando Magazine. No, Winter Park Magazine. I write a column. It's a quarterly magazine, and I write a column on a variety of things. Most of it is humor, but not all of it. I think one of my first columns was writing on what a fiasco the Trader Joe's parking lot is. If you've been there,
well, I know that that fiasco.
But
Yeah.
the thing is that's a typical column for me because one of those like shared experience things. And the thing is that. Well, anyway, the thing about that I enjoyed doing it, and the Trader Joe's people were amused too, because I wasn't insulting them or their food. It's just what a fiasco. It turns out that's their business model. That's intentional.
Really?
Yes, it's intentional. And but that kind of column. And
for anybody who doesn't know, let me just interject here. The Trader Joe's, at least the one here in Winter Park, is an absolute zoo in the parking lot.
It is.
I mean, they have plus. Not only is it just not big enough for them, there's other businesses around there
and they
who must be going crazy not having any place to park.
And they love that. And
Yeah.
I was so shocked. I did a little bit of research. I found that the very first one they opened like 50 years ago in California, it the same thing. It's a fiasco, the parking there. And then that is their business model. They if you look at all the Trader Joe's around the country, that's what they have in common.
And they want to do that because what?
Okay, first of all, the stores are smaller than Whole Foods or Publix or somewhere like that. They're not usually those is places like Whole Foods and Publix. They're standalone, right? Usually, pretty much.
Yeah.
But the Trader Joe's are always part of a smaller, like they are here in Winter Park,
shopping center,
shopping center. Having to share parking spaces. So first of all, it's smaller, it's lower overhead. They have to pay less for overhead for the land. It's cheaper land, and so they argue, and it shows in their prices. I've seen it. Is that because their overhead is so much lower, they can offer some really cool stuff at lower prices. They're not going to compete with Walmart. They're not trying to, but their prices actually are lower than Publix and Whole Foods, and they have
interesting products too.
Yeah, they really cool signature their own products, and they really are catering to the same basic audience as like Whole Foods and Publix. But anyway, I was fascinated to find out that this is actually by design. And I interviewed some people in the parking lot who are loading up with stuff, and I'm saying, well, what do you think of the parking here? They said, oh, it really sucks. And I said, well, why do you keep coming? They said, one guy said, have you tried their five cheese Greek spiral? I said, no. He says, it's to die for.
Yeah,
he said, it's like crack.
Yeah.
And so that's why people keep coming back. So anyway, I did that, and then I did other things like recently. My last one was on looking back at 4 years of the pandemic and what life was, what it's been like,
right,
and things like that. So it goes from the sublime to the ridiculous. Probably more ridiculous than anything else. But
well, Greg, we're glad you're here in Orlando. We're glad you're still writing, and we're glad you're here on the show. So
I'm delighted. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for being here, and we'll see you at the next episode.
I would love that.
Thank you, Greg. Thanks for joining us for another episode of Books and Beyond from the Winter Park Library. This podcast would not be possible without the generous help and support from the library staff, and especially from Jeremy Zorn. Jeremy's official title is Public Services Librarian, but he does many things here at the library, including producing this podcast. We can't do this without you, Jeremy. Our theme music is from the song Don't Go by Bovine Joe and the Buffalo Herd. That's Herd spelled H-E-A-R-D. We hope you'll let your friends and others know about this podcast and that you'll come by the library for one of our offerings, which you can find at winterparklibrary.org/events. That's winterparklibrary.org/events. If you have questions or suggestions for the podcast or just want to talk about Books and Beyond, please send an email to podcast@winterparklibrary.org. That's an email to podcast@winterparklibrary.org. Remember that the Winter Park Library promotes the free and open exchange of ideas and does not attempt to control or take responsibility for any opinions that may be expressed in this podcast. Opinions expressed in this podcast do not constitute or imply an endorsement or a reflection of the library's policies or beliefs. This is Michael Werner, wishing you well until our next episode of Books and Beyond.